starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started today. Thanks everybody for coming to the webinar. As usual, we're going to try and make this pretty quick and seamless. This is a very 10,000-foot view of some of the stuff that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about reminders in local match and public transit. Reminders, we're not going to talk about them. I'm going to give out some reminders on some reporting requirements and stuff like that. We are recording this session, so it will be available on the YouTube channel sometime later this afternoon. And at the end, you'll find the link to the YouTube channel and a link to a SurveyMonkey form. Please fill out that form. I definitely appreciate all of the input that everybody provides, and definitely try to incorporate that as much as I can into the presentations. If you have a question, please use the question box at the bottom of your dashboard screen, or the dashboard component on the right-hand side of your screen. At least I think that's where it is for most of you. That'll come to me only. Nobody else will see it. I'll do my best to answer it here within this program. Otherwise, I'll get back to you individually and try to answer it. So with that, let's go ahead and jump right in. We're going to talk today about, first of all, some reminders. What exactly is supposed to be happening as far as quarterly reports are concerned. We're going to talk about contracting opportunities and how we need those reported and what they are and what to look for. And then some quick reminders about procurement activity. As many of you are aware, we just recently finished up a survey of, I shouldn't say a survey, an analysis rather, of our corrective action that was required as part of our procurement survey, or a procurement system review that was conducted by FTA a couple years ago. We're still having a little bit of difficulty in some areas, so I want to go over some of the activity that's producing the difficulties and the deficiencies that we've encountered. I just kind of give everybody a quick heads up on what's going to be required. Excuse me. Then we're going to talk about local match. As everybody I'm sure is aware, the state has not passed their budget yet. We are definitely in a situation, kind of a holding pattern situation. The governor's not moving on his end, state legislature's not moving on their end, and there's no end in sight. As a result, we've already had a couple of systems that have had to either suspend service entirely or drastically suspend service to essentials only as a result of this. So we want to keep that from happening in the future, and although we preach it quite a bit, we're going to preach it again, the importance of local match, generating local match, and what role it plays in transit finance, how you're supposed to report it, how you're able to use the unused or carry forward revenue that's not used on a quarterly basis, and then what types of local match resources are available out there. So again, if at any point in time you have questions, make sure you use that question box in your control panel. First, the reminders, quarterly reporting. We just ended our fiscal year at the end of June, a couple months ago, and we still had some difficulties getting in various requests and various reports, and still missing a few, to be perfectly honest. So I just wanted to go over real quickly what's required and make sure that everybody is aware of that. The first, quarterly reports, all of them, every report that's due on a quarterly basis is due within 30 days following the end of the quarter. That's your DOPE requests, both either estimates or actuals, primarily actuals. Estimates are usually due before the beginning of the quarter. And that's not estimates, excuse me, those are advances. 5311, 5316, which is JARC, and 5317, which is New Freedom. If you have 5316 and 17 operating assistance agreements, those requisitions are due at the same time as the 5311 and DOPE requisitions are due. And that's 30 days following the end of the reporting period. There's also two letters that we ask you to provide for us. One is a DBE letter, Disadvantaged Business Enterprise letter, that basically speaks to your contracting activity and whether or not you've had any opportunities to enlist services from disadvantaged business enterprises. And the other is charter letter, and along with a charter form, or the DBE letter has a form with it. I apologize for the wrong. Along with the DBE form. But the other is a charter letter that basically speaks to whether or not you had the opportunity to provide any charter service, whether you were approached to provide any charter service, what, if any, was the outcome, and if you did provide service, we need some detail and specifics on the service itself. Now, the DBE letters currently are coming to us on agency letterhead, which means usually it's coming from the grant recipients. Sometimes it comes from an operator. It doesn't really matter. What we're going to look to do in the future is combine those two reporting requirements, charter and DBE, into a single form that we will develop and send out to everybody. You'll fill it out, whether it's all zeros or whether it's a whole bunch of other information, doesn't matter. You'll fill it out. You'll certify it like you do everything else, and then you'll submit that along with your standard quarterly requisitions. I hate to pile on new reports, but that's okay. That's kind of what we got to do. And that's being driven by the fact that we have to report that information routinely upwards to the FDA. So we want to make sure we're collecting it on a basis that aligns with how often we have to report it to the FDA. You'll also have to, as usual, as most of you know, most of you are PCOMs, you have to submit a quarterly PCOM report, and that report just basically speaks to what activity the PCOM undertook, not only from the perspective of, reviewed and approved requisitions and revenue expenditures and things like that, but also what did the PCOM do to further the transportation program, how did they get out and engage the community, what local revenue resources did they go after, et cetera, et cetera. Excuse me. I apologize for that. Also included in that quarterly reporting is a PTA reconciliation form. This is your public transit account reconciliation form. This is a log of all of the incoming and outgoing financial activity for your public transit account. That'll be submitted quarterly as well, also signed off on. Service contract revenue form, which basically feeds the PTA form to one degree or another. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And then the Grant Funds Recovery Act report, formerly known as SB 51, for those that have been around for quite some time. That too is required on a quarterly basis. The difference between that one and all of the other reports is all of those reports above the GFRA report is something that you submit proactively. The Grant Funds Recovery Act report is something that you submit reactively. What I mean by that is the Grant Funds Recovery Act report is generated here within DIPIT every quarter based on what active projects and what projects have to report are active at that particular time. We generate that list, we confirm everything on that list, and then someone from our program support team, either Nancy Stroyer or Nick Haddad, will send out an email that says, hey, it's time to input this information. Here's where you can find your report, whether it's capital or operating, and here's the grant that you have to report on. For some of you, you might get 11 or 12 of those. You might have 11 or 12 open grants that require a report, and you got to report on each one of them. Others might only get one or two. It just depends. But that, again, is something that you'll complete and submit to us reactive to the email or notification that you receive from our program support team. Everything else is proactive. You guys already have copies of all of the stuff that's in there. All the stuff that's above that we talk about. When I sent out the email this morning that contained the PowerPoint presentation, I also included a zip file. Some of you who didn't receive that zip file due to technology restrictions, I apologize, but contained in the zip file was all the documentation that went out with the FY16 application. So it wasn't something new. There was nothing in that zip file that you didn't already have access to. We're not going to go over any of those details or any of those documents. We're not going to open them up. I just wanted to make sure that everybody had them, so that if there was a specific question, you could refer back to the form that we might be talking about. So again, I apologize if you didn't get that. If you'd like a copy of it, let me know, and we'll figure out a different way to get that information to you if it was blocked by your IT department. Okay. Excuse me. So, sorry, going back. I wanted to talk real quick about this area here, the service contract revenue form and the public transit account reconciliation form. These are pretty important forms to have on a monthly basis, or excuse me, on a quarterly basis. And the reason for that is Um, the service contract revenue form is the form that you use every quarter to identify how much local revenue you collected during the reporting period. So if it's $1,000, you're going to input the $1,000 on that form. Also on that form, you'll indicate in the various areas what your quarterly expenses were for that reporting period. And then it'll do its fancy schmancy calculating, and it'll spit out how much local match is required for that reporting period. It'll also take into account how much local revenue you collected. So what it'll tell you then by taking those different pieces of data and manipulating them in the way that it has to, it will tell you whether or not you have to come up with additional local resources, meaning you didn't collect enough in local match to meet your matching requirement, or whether or not you have too much. You collected more than you needed to meet your local matching requirement. If you didn't collect enough, for obvious reasons, you'll have to go over to the revenue sheet and indicate how much other local revenue you're going to contribute to meet the matching requirement and where you got that from. If you collected more than you needed for that particular reporting period, you only needed 1,000, you collected 1,500. The unused balance, the additional 500 in our example, would then have a corresponding entry on the public transit account reconciliation form. I want to again reiterate this, and we'll talk about it again at a later point. All of the revenue generated through the use of project equipment belongs to the transit system, meaning that it basically belongs to the grant recipient, or the county in this case, or mass transit, or whomever. It belongs to the grant recipient, not the operator. The other thing is that revenue, however much it is, has to be used for transit-related activities. You can make a capital purchase with it. You can spend it on an operating expense if you want to, whatever the case may be. But the funding has to go toward transit-related activity. Okay, we've had some issues in the past with grant recipients who didn't quite fully understand that restriction, if you want to call it that, or that requirement, and went out and spent excess service contract revenue or excess local revenue on agency activity or agency purchases, capital or fixed asset that might benefit the agency as a whole, but was not transit related or transit specific. That's the one caveat to generating some local match that might have to sit there for quite some time, is you have to use it on transit related activities. All of the local match that you generate, whether it's through a service contract, whether it's a donation, whether it's a grant payment from another grant, another non-DOT grant or another state agency type of a grant, whatever that local revenue is going to be reported first and foremost on that service contract revenue form in the quarter in which you receive it. Any unused or excess carry forward stuff is going to move itself over to the public transit account reconciliation form. So what we'll be able to see is you collected X amount of dollars in local revenue, you used Y amount to meet your matching requirement for the billing period, and then you transferred Z amount over to your public transit account. So all of those numbers should line up perfectly with one another. On the PTA reconciliation form, we had a bit of a discussion with a grant recipient recently about whether or not they should be recording payments on the PTA reconciliation form that have not yet been received. For example, 5311 pay requests that have been submitted but not yet received. And we've kind of taken the default position that your PTA acts as sort of like a de facto checkbook for your public transit account. That's both true and false simultaneously. This, like everything else, is reported on an accrual basis. So if you submitted a request for payment but haven't received the payment yet, you'll still need to indicate that on your public transit account reconciliation form and make that statement publicly to make sure that I let the grant recipient I misled earlier in the week know, hey, that's my fault. I gave you the wrong information. This is the correct information. Your PTA account reconciliation form has the same accrual guidelines that every other reporting form has. So even if you've not necessarily received a check from the state for the reimbursement request that you submitted, because you would have earned that reimbursement within a specific period, you'll record it within that period. Let's make sure we're adjusting accordingly. Okay. Sorry. Let me get rid of those. There we go. Okay. So back up a second here. Okay, now going along with our reminder process, contracting opportunities. Contracting opportunities are required to be reported every year in the application. In essence, when you're making your budget at the beginning of the year, we expect that you're going to have a general idea of what you're going to need to buy throughout that year using the funding that you're applying for. Any opportunity to enter into a contract for services or for fixed assets or anything of the like that exceeds $10,000, we want you to report that in your application. That way we can not only track it, but we have a more thorough and accurate sense of where the money is going to be going. It's unfortunately not enough just to see it on a line item. We want to make sure that we understand, exactly where it's going to end up as far as the point of sale, so to speak. There's a section at the bottom of the budget page, Exhibit B of the application, where you are supposed to enter your contracting opportunities, anything over $10,000 to a single vendor. Okay, that is not just $10,000 in straight expenses. That's true contracting opportunities where you're going to enter into an agreement to purchase a set number of items or a set type of service for a set fee. That's kind of what we're talking about, an official contract, not just a garden variety. I'm going to 7-Eleven and buying $300 worth of gas. This is true contracting opportunities. So make sure that those are entered in that contract. That's the first step. The second step, once you've done that, you've submitted everything, you're humming along in your fiscal year. The second step is notifying IDOT when you're getting ready to make any type of a procurement, whether it's an operating procurement, whether it's a professional services procurement, a fixed asset procurement, whether you're paying for it with a capital grant or an operating grant, doesn't matter. You have an obligation to notify us when you're making these purchases. For capital grants and fixed asset type capital procurement activity, any of it using federal funding, this is all tied back to the federal funding. If you're going to use state-only funding, there might be an entirely different set of requirements. We'll talk about that at another informational session. But for right now, we're going to focus on just those awards or just those purchases that are using the federal funds. Or any federal funds, not just federal funds, any federal funds. IDOT must be notified for all capital procurement activity. IDOT must be notified in writing, and an email suffices. It doesn't have to be some signed letter. Must be notified in writing of all capital procurement activity using federal funds within 30 days of the activity or post-award. So if on September 1st you go out and sign a contract to purchase some shop equipment for your maintenance shop, and the total is going to be $15,000, we want to make sure that we're notified of that. And so Carlos Campos and his team of project managers are going to expect to see some sort of an email from you saying, hey, this is what we purchased, here's who we purchased it from, and by the way, here is your, if you'll notice that third bullet point right there, here's the support documentation. Here's a copy of the contract, or here's a purchase order that we used to purchase off of a term contract, whatever the case may be. That support documentation has to be submitted along with the notification. Okay. On the other side of life, the operating side of life, IDOT must be notified in writing of all operating procurement activity using federal funds prior to the purchase or award. So if you're going to go out and purchase insurance for your vehicles, and the total contract amount is going to be around $50,000 or $60,000, you don't have to necessarily get concurrence from us, but you got to let us know before you go out to make that purchase. We would prefer to know before you do any solicitations for RFPs. That's kind of how we're looking at it, but we definitely need to know before you actually obligate the funding to any kind of a contract. Okay, and the support documentation, contracts or purchase orders, like I said earlier, must accompany that notification. Now, for the capital side, because it's a post-award, it's really easy to do. You make copies of all the contracts or purchase orders, you filter them on up to us along with the request, and everybody's happy. On the pre-award, or excuse me, on the operating side, it might be a little bit different because you have to notify us before you make the award. But what we want to see at that point in time is probably just a copy of the contract that you intend to provide to the contractor, or that you intend to sign or execute before you sign or execute it. Um, uh, and then we'll go from there. And sometime in the future, hopefully, we'll be able to kind of revisit this and perhaps align those two processes so that they mirror one another. But for the time being, this is just kind of where we're at. So make sure you're reminded of that and that you're participating in that. Unfortunately, this area right here, this notification section, is where we took the greatest hit in our procurement system review. Because unfortunately, I think I just paused everything. That's okay. Because unfortunately, what ended up happening was folks were going out who didn't have a concurrence requirement. It happened primarily on the operating side of life. Folks were going out and making purchases that were under $100,000, but never notifying us that they did so. And the FTA came in and said, yeah, even though you have this concurrence requirement, you still need to know what's being purchased. So what are you going to do to fix the fact that you don't know what's being purchased? And so we're kind of just reminding everybody what's happening here. We're going to make some changes to our procurement policy a little bit and try to get a better grasp on those types of things and align the capital and operating a little bit better. So you can look for that in the future. But as of today, for right now, these 3 bullet points are the most important ones to pay attention to. Okay? Oops. Okay. Concurrence. Yep. Okay. Concurrence requirements. Sorry about that, folks. For capital grants, each procurement, irrespective of what it is, has some threshold under which you have to go to IDOT and get approval before you undertake the activity. It's very important to know what those thresholds are and who you have to contact for that approval. Okay, so we're going to start with capital grants. Under capital grants, your pre-solicitation or pre-bid concurrence has to take place for any contract that you're going to enter into over $10,000. It doesn't matter what you're going to buy. If it's going to be more than $10,000, you have to submit your concurrence packet to Carlos and his team before you advertise or solicit for your bids or proposals, whether you're doing an RFP, IFP, doesn't matter. Before you run your advertisement and make the solicitation for proposals, if it's going to be more than $10,000, you have to get Carlos's approval to move forward before you can. Okay. For any contract, and that's the extent of that. Once that's done, you can go out and do what you got to do. If your award is going to be more than $100,000, added to that pre-solicitation requirement is a pre-award concurrence requirement, where before you actually execute the agreement, any agreement more than $100,000 for services or fixed assets, whatever, before you execute that award, you have to submit information to Carlos and his team making a similar request. Here's what we did. Here's how we undertook it. Here was our process. Please grant your concurrence on this particular award, et cetera, et cetera. Anytime you do a sole source award, and a sole source award is just where you basically make an award with a single agency or a single vendor for a specific service or asset. And there's a whole lot of different requirements that go along with that, but you're basically doing this without going through the competitive solicitation process. You're not going to advertise. You're not going to accept bids. You're not going to look at qualifications. None of that stuff. You know that this is the only person you could buy it from. The most common occurrence with something like this is usually software additions. Your agency has CTS software. You need to purchase a mapping component, or you've annexed a new area and you need to go into a new service area, and you have to go purchase the GIS information for your new service area from your software vendor. That's a sole source award. Anytime you make a sole source award, again, a contracting opportunity, not just a point of sale purchase. Anytime you make a sole source award to a vendor for services or assets, regardless of the amount that you're spending, you have to get IDOT concurrence before you make that award. Okay? On the operating side of life, pre-solicitation, that concurrence requirement is anything over $100,000. So before you go out and run your advertisement to solicit bid information or proposal information for your vehicle insurance award, which is going to be $120,000 for that year, You have to write to us, submit a whole bunch of information and paperwork to us, and make sure that we've looked it over and granted our concurrence before the advertisement runs. Now, I keep hammering this before point. I'm going to get to why here in just a second. And then the award threshold for contracting and executing a contract is the same for operating as it is for capital. It's $100,000. Anything over $100,000 that you're going to obligate under a contract with a vendor for services or assets, you have to get IDOT concurrence before you execute that contract. And then the sole source award threshold is exactly the same as it is on the capital side. Anytime you're going to do a sole source award to a vendor, you have to let us know, irrespective of what the dollar figure is. Now, I keep hammering this before it takes place notion, because unfortunately we've seen a lot of instances where we're going to go out to bid for insurance services on September 1st, and IDOT receives a concurrence request on August 15th. That's not enough time for us to review the concurrence request, make sure that it meets federal and state regulations, and grant their concurrence before the bid actually runs. As part of our updated procurement requirements that you'll see in very short future, you'll make note, hopefully, that there is a 45 to 60-day requirement for solicitation, pre-solicitation concurrence. So when you submit your pre-solicitation concurrence to us, we're going to require that you do that a minimum of 45 days before the solicitation is due to run. That way we have ample time to review everything, ask questions, and gather additional support documentation if necessary, and then grant an approval or grant a concurrence before the solicitation runs. Okay? Let's make sure we're doing that. Pre-award's a little bit different because there isn't necessarily a fixed window under which a contract has to be executed. Now, for some of our more time-sensitive things like insurance and workers' compensation and things like that, we understand that there's a time restraint, but there usually is not a hard, set-in-stone date that it has to be executed by. In those instances where there is, we're going to ask that pre-award concurrence requests be filed to us between 60 and 90 days minimum. And the reason I say that is once we reach a certain threshold, which is around $250,000, the pre-award concurrence can no longer take place here within DIPIT offices. Now we have to involve the Chief Counsel's office, the Secretary's office, and a whole bunch of other folks down in Springfield. That adds 4 to 6 weeks of processing time to our concurrence review. So let's make sure we're taking that into consideration as well. Now, hopefully your project managers are working with you side by side to let you know, hey, this is what's happening, this is what needs to take place with this type of a concurrence, so make sure you're planning accordingly. But if you're not, hopefully you'll remember this conversation at least until the new procurement policies kind of get disseminated, and then we can get it down into black and white writing. Now, I'm going to go over this all again just to make absolutely certain that we're clear. By not conducting your procurements with these types of concurrence requirements and notification requirements in mind, you can actually render an eligible expense ineligible. Okay, I want to make perfectly clear that is a real result. If you do not undertake these activities and you don't obtain these concurrences where you're required to obtain them, you run the possibility that expense would be ineligible. And if you'd been reimbursed for that expense and we deem it to be ineligible, you'll be responsible for repaying any reimbursements that you received. You don't want to take that when you're talking six-figure contracts or you're talking six-figure fixed asset purchases. You don't want to run that type of a risk. So make sure that you're following these concurrence requirements and notification requirements across the board. That way you don't even have to worry about it at that point in time. Okay, so again, we kind of just flew through the procurement stuff. That's okay. This isn't necessarily anything new, I don't think, to anybody, but just make sure that you're keeping this in mind, especially on this operating side of life where the pre-solicitation concurrence kicks in at $100,000, but it may not, you may not necessarily be over that $100,000, and so you feel that You can notify IDOT whenever. That's not the case. You have to make sure that you're notifying us before you're obligating those funds. All right. So we lead into now local match. And for this is a really important subject now because of our ensuing budget issue. What we're finding, unfortunately, is that a lot of folks do not have local revenue that they can lean on to pay for their operating expenses while they're waiting for reimbursement from us or waiting for reimbursement from another program or whatever the case may be. They just don't have a whole lot of local operating revenue. And we've been preaching now for quite some time. I've been standing on my soapbox in front of you guys for a long time, telling you how important local revenue is. Now, we usually frame that under the guise of how important service contracts are. Service contracts, local revenue, they're kind of interchangeable when we start to talk about them. But basically what we're basically saying is you still have the responsibility, both in writing from a statutory requirement perspective and just an inherent responsible manager perspective. You still have the requirement to go out, beat the grass, and generate your local revenue. That local matching requirement or local participation requirement is not just financial in nature. It is a lot more than that, but it smooths your financial road considerably if you're proactive and you're successful in engaging the community and generating some revenue. Excuse me. I want to remind everybody that the grant recipient is ultimately responsible for ensuring that local revenue is being pursued. Now, this can take a lot of different forms depending on your relationship with your operator or operators if you have multiple. But at the end of the day, we're going to go back to the county, the grant recipient, and say, hey, you guys were the ones responsible for making sure that your system generated its local participation. What happened? If something falls through the cracks or if you have to shut your service down because you don't have any local dollars, we're going to ask you what happened. What did you do to engage your community and try to build that local revenue base? It's always going to fall to the grantee. And it does and doesn't simultaneously matter what your agreement with your operator states. We're still going to look to the grant recipient to say, hey, you're the responsible party for this funding. What did you do to ensure that this was taking place? With that, we know that a lot of grant recipients will pass through the responsibility of generating local revenue to the operator. That's fine. We don't have a problem with that. You can do that. But understand that all of the revenue generated through the use of federal funds or project equipment belongs to the grant recipient, meaning it belongs to the transit program. And that transit program is still the grant recipient's responsibility. Okay? That's why we want to see unused transit revenues, unused local revenues, dumped back into the transit account because it belongs to the transit system, which in turn is the grantee responsibility. So that's why we look for that type of a relationship. So make sure that everybody understands that. Even though you as the operator might sign on the dotted line for that service contract or for that purchase of service agreement, that is still the grantee's ultimate responsibility. You're doing that on behalf of the grantee, not on behalf of your individual operating agency. Okay, so keep that in mind. Excuse me. The local participation is a requirement of both the federal and state programs. Because we have a robust state operating assistance program does not absolve grant recipients of the responsibility to generate local revenue or to have a local match or a local participation available should they need it. And for your federal program, that can be anywhere from 20 to 50% of match, depending on the program and depending on the type of expense that you're claiming. For your state program, that can be anywhere from 35 to 45%, depending on what the governor happens to approve that year. Again, I'm using general terms and possibly, some terms that have never necessarily been an issue for us, but I want to make it perfectly clear, neither one of these programs, state or federal, guarantee you 100% reimbursement of your eligible operating expenses. It's fortunate that one can be used to match the other, but neither one of them guarantee 100% reimbursement. you're always going to have the responsibility of demonstrating how you're generating a local participation, your local financial participation. And we accept a lot of different ways, but you always have that responsibility, so keep that in mind. And if anything, this budget impasse that we're experiencing right now really shines a great big bright light on that fact, because we don't have an approved budget, and it doesn't look like we're going to get one anytime soon. We don't have the ability to obligate through a contract any of those downstate operating assistance dollars that everybody is so accustomed to having. Now all of a sudden your local programs become that much more important. Your local revenue rather becomes that much more important, because you have to use that to match your federal program. Once we're able to iron out the kinks and maybe perhaps get a contract out to you for the federal share of your programs, you'll still need to meet the matching requirements. It's not going to be reimbursed at 100%. So you have to be prepared for that. That's why this local revenue becomes so important. Okay? It is critical in transit financing that you have this local pot of money, or this local stream of income. It has the most flexible use. We've talked about this a lot of times. It's the most flexible use. It doesn't have to be used for operating expenses. It doesn't have to be used for capital expenses. It can be used across the board, but it has to be used for transit-related expenses. And we already talked about the federal state budget delays and how that money can cushion some of those issues when we encounter these bureaucratic political games with transit funding. And this is happening in great big, loud, booming, resonant circumstances down in Springfield right now. But there's also been a lot of concerns at the federal level about whether or not transit funding can or will be available in future years. If you followed reauthorization news at all, you understand that we've had some highway trust fund solvency concerns in recent months. And there was a time there where we weren't 100% sure we were even going to get federal funding. So again, those two conditions just kind of really call into play the importance of local resources and making sure that you're maximizing those local resources. And then finally, it's critical in transit financing because it provides a layer of liquidity for your program while we not only have to wait out these federal and state budget delays, but while you're waiting through the time lapse between the moment you submit a requisition for reimbursements and the time that the actual reimbursement hits your account. So it gives you that layer of security and that layer of liquidity to continue to operate your service. Again, critically important to making sure that there's a seamless level of service available to your customers, regardless of what the funding picture looks like at the state and federal level. And then finally, in my opinion, one of the most critical components that doesn't have a dollar value assigned to it is it builds community relations. We talk a lot about the responsibility of public transportation managers and administrators and executives. We all have to be that champion for public transit. We all have to be willing to kind of get out there and really preach the virtues, but build those community relations, build those partnerships with other agencies within our community, and make sure that we're hitting those transit disadvantaged population groups in the community and that they have full and complete robust access to service. Approaching those types of agencies and those types of areas about services that they can purchase from you, or how everybody can kind of work together in a coordinated environment, it just goes that much further to foster those community relations, so that even if you're not necessarily getting a dollar value contribution from that agency, you can rely on them to help spread the word about public transit, grab the ear of the public, and perhaps grab the ear of your local elected officials, and maybe have that build to rather a contribution from the local municipality. There's a lot of different avenues that you can take if you have good, strong community relations with your agency partners through public transit. So make sure that you're doing that. You as PCOMs have that inherent responsibility. Transit executives, operators, managers, they all have that responsibility. So this goes a long way when we talk about how we finance our programs. So make sure we're doing that. How do we report revenue? We encounter this sometimes in a little bit of confusion. I want to make sure that we're clear. all revenue collected during the period has to be reported. It's going to be reported in several different ways in several different places, but it all has to be reported. At the end of the day, the end of your reporting period, you have to know I collected this amount of local revenue. I spent this portion of it over here, this portion of it over here, and then this portion went and sat in the bank account for a little while. All of those X's and O's have to add up, or all of those dollars and cents have to add up. It all has to be perfectly balanced at the end of the day. So we got to make sure we're going to report all revenue collected during the period. And we're going to start on the quarterly revenue service contracts form. Section 2 of that form is going to indicate who you collected it from, how much you collected, and what type of program it collected it for. Was it a service contract, a donation, a grant, whatever the case may be. You're going to indicate the amount that you used for local match if you had to. If you had a need in that particular reporting period to use some out-of-pocket funding to meet your matching requirement, that's where you report that. And then any amount that's retained by the operator, and we kind of touched on that briefly. A lot of grant recipients will allow the operators to enter into these revenue service contracts, provide the service, bill the servicing agency or serviced agency, and then collect payment from the serviced agency. And then just as a condition of their agreement to be a provider, they're able to retain that revenue to help pay for upcoming operating expenses. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that type of a relationship as long as you're indicating how much the operator actually retained on the public transit account reconciliation form. That way we're across the board gathering up the information that we need to, and we know exactly where everything went, exactly where all of the revenue was generated, and exactly how it was spent. That's the biggest issue. Excuse me. And then any unused revenue, any balance that wasn't used, is going to be moved over to the public transit account reconciliation form. Again, that's where you'll report the amount that you collected during that period. On your non-dope local match survey form, this is where you'll report all of the amounts that were available to you to use for local match. So under this example, we have a service contract with a local senior service center for $25,000. That's how much our contract was from July 1st through June 30th. However, during the period of July 1st through June 30th, we only collected $20,000. What we'll look for on your quarterly revenue service contracts form and your PTA reconciliation form, we'll look to add up all of the dollars and cents from the senior service center across those forms and be able to see that you collected $20,000 in revenue from that agency. But on your non-dope local match survey form, you'll report the full contract award amount of $25,000 because that's how much you could have collected throughout the course of the year had you incurred enough expenses to do so. Okay? It can seem kind of confusing. I understand that. We're hoping that as these reports mature and evolve, that perhaps we can provide a little bit better clarity in moving forward. But that's the difference. The primary difference between the two is one is going to be how much you collected. The other is going to be how much you could have collected. So we just want to make sure that we're reporting all that information in the appropriate way. This non-dope local match survey form is an annual form. The PTA reconciliation form and the revenue service contract form is a quarterly form. Now, PTA and service contracts have an annual component to them, but those are just roll-ups that are built from filling out the quarterly forms. The non-dope local match survey form is just an annual form. Okay. Unused carry forward revenue, like we said, once again, this is grantee controlled. It does not belong to the operator. The operator does not own it in any way, shape, or form. It belongs to the grantee. It is not going to be used by the operator for expenses in the upcoming billing period or to meet the local matching requirement. It is expected to be deposited into the public transit account. Again, the extent to which grant recipients allow operators to keep service contract revenue depends entirely on your agreement with them, but it all still has to be recorded. And that's what we will look for, is how much was used, where was it used, It all has to add up. All of that unused funding has to be maintained in a public transit account. Whatever is not accounted for in your agreement with the operator or through actual expenses for either operating expenses or capital expenses or something along those lines, whatever's not accounted for has to be deposited and placed into that PTA account. It's non-negotiable. Okay. It has to be used for transit-related activities or purchases, not indirectly transit-related. It has to be direct transit-related activities. So if you're a senior center operator and there's $100,000 sitting in the public transit account, you wouldn't be able to use $25,000 of it to go out and refurbish the senior center offices, even though indirectly that benefits the transit program. It's not a direct transit related activity. So all of that unused revenue, all of that carry forward revenue has to be used for transit related activities or purchases. Okay, make that perfectly clear. So we talk about how to record it. We talk about how important it is to have. We talk about how it helps in building relations with the communities. So where do we get it? Where does it all come from? Take dope out of the picture for a second, because we are talking about local resources. Take dope out of the picture for a second, by force in this instance, but just take it out of the picture. Where do we get revenue? How can we generate revenue? The number one area is service contract revenue. We've talked about this and talked about this until we're blue in the face over the years, just how important it is to go out there and engage local social service agencies that you know have transportation disadvantaged clients or consumers, whatever you want to characterize them. Engage them. Find out what their transportation needs are. Invite them to the table to discuss, coordinated activities or how the transit system can benefit their consumers. Make sure that you're doing that. Make sure you can identify those types of agencies. Some of our transit programs advertise on board their vehicles, and some of them have pretty lucrative annual contracts for advertisement on board the vehicle. So there can be some decent revenue to be made through allowing local agencies, local for-profit agencies, to kind of advertise on your vehicle. And it doesn't have to be for-profit; it can be anybody. But to allow local businesses to advertise on board your vehicles can be relatively lucrative. And if it's done in an organized fashion, it can be pretty eye-catching too. So you're not only getting that local business noticed, but you're also getting your public transit system noticed. So it has a dual benefit there. Contributed services, we kind of try to shy away from these. You usually only see this in a much larger transit system, but contributed services is a source of local match, and that's where basically somebody will offer services that would have otherwise been an expense to transit systems, but they don't actually pay for it because it's a contributed service. You can use the value of that service to meet your matching requirement. So that kind of helps as well. It's kind of complicated. It can be a bit of a pain in the butt. I'm not saying I don't recommend it. I'm not saying I do recommend it. I'm saying just keep that in mind, that there is a couple of extra layers of administrative responsibility that go along with claiming contributed services as a match. So just keep that in mind. And then any other sources of non-DOT federal funding are available. Here are just a couple of quick snapshots of what types of non-DOT federal funding are available out there. Department of Health and Human Services, Labor, Education, Housing, and Urban Development. These are the types of programs that they administer, that each one of those administers. TANF is something needy families. I can't think of what the T and the A is for. I apologize. Excuse me. Medicaid, we're all familiar with. Title IIIB, most of us are familiar with. Each of those is a federal program administered by a state agency. So it might be sometimes difficult to identify which local agencies are recipients of TANF grants or recipients of Title IIIB grants. But again, these are just kind of how it can be difficult sometimes to know what state agency administers the federal program as well. But these are just some ideas. Workforce Investment Act, Senior Community Service Employment, Vocational Rehabilitation Grants, Community Development Block Grants. All of these have the ability to be used as a match for transit operations, public transportation operations. So seek out seek out agencies rather in your communities that have these types of programs and engage them in conversation and build rapport with them and talk about how the transit system can benefit their programs and their grants and their constituents and make sure that you're engaged in that process. There is a wealth of information available as usual. Did I put it on here? Oh, I did. I'll go to that in a second. There's a wealth of information available as usual from the FTA website. APTA also has some stuff, but the Community Transportation Association of America has a coordination toolkit, a coordination handbook, if you will. And at the very back of that coordination handbook, and the ICCT primer process has a similar handbook, at the back of that handbook is a big gigantic table of federal funds that are available for use in coordinated systems. And that's really what we're talking about, is coordinated transportation programs. And they list just a huge variety, 55, 60, 70 different types of federal programs rather, that are available for use in coordinated systems. So reach out there and take advantage of Ed Heflin and his team and ask them for that information. Carol Montague is probably the best source of information there. And then reach out to the Community Transportation Association of America. It's right there somewhere on their webpage. I apologize, I don't remember where. And then the Easter Seals Project Action is another fantastic coordination resource for finding out where these programs are and what types of agencies in your communities might be beneficiaries of these programs. So definitely reach out and find those. Some of the more cumbersome sources of local match are taxes. Not everybody obviously has the ability to do taxes, but if you can build a good solid community relationship and engage your public elected officials and build the brand of public transportation, it's possible to have a sales tax that benefits the transportation program directly. Or not sales tax, it's a tax, doesn't have to be sales, a tax that benefits the transportation program directly. For some of the communities out there that are very pro-transit, they're more than willing to see their property taxes raise a little bit or to see their income tax raise a little bit or whatever to help support the transportation program. This is usually an option that's explored more in the urban settings than it is in the rural settings, but it is still an option for rural environments as well. Granted, not one we have control over, but still an option. Then there's leasing and concessions. Again, a little bit more difficult for most of our operators because we are pass-through operators primarily. That's usually the nature of most of our arrangements. But for those of you that have transit facilities, you can lease space within your transit facility. If you keep vending machines, you can have an area for vending machines. You can use a revenue generated from use of the vending machines to meet your local match. That's all well and good and FTA approved, so to speak. Farebox is still a source of local revenue, but it has a slightly different impact, doesn't have quite as much flexibility. Farebox revenue for us is used to lower the operating deficit, which in turn lowers your matching requirement. So it has the same effect to a certain extent that other sources of revenue do, in that it lowers your requirement or lowers how much you have to use from other resources. The downside to farebox revenue, to be perfectly honest, is that you're usually talking about a very, very small percentage, 1, 2, 3, 5% of your overall operating expenses can be recovered from farebox revenue. And since we are talking about transportation disadvantaged individuals, it's highly unlikely that you're going to want to charge $6 or $7 or $8 or $10 per ride, because that actually provides more of a disincentive for people. And we're talking about a lot of folks in a lot of instances who are on fixed incomes or very low incomes. So we don't want to put the use of transportation out of their reach, per se. But farebox revenue is a way to help lower your deficit and lower your match requirement. You increase ridership, you lower your overall cost of service anyway, and then you lower your overall operating deficit by increased farebox revenue. And then contributions, my favorite, because they usually come with no strings attached. Get your local government involved. Grant recipients are all local governments, and they should be willing, if not already participating financially in this program in some form or another. We frown heavily, and not just us, everybody in the transportation world frowns heavily on grant recipients and local governments who don't want to contribute to the transportation program. I personally frown very heavily on grant recipients who receive the money, whose constituency benefits from these programs, but who doesn't want any responsibility, financial or otherwise, in the project. Now, we can't control that. We understand that. Purse strings are tight everywhere. We understand that as well. But there are other ways in which the local government can contribute that may not necessarily be immediately financial, or that may not necessarily be bank breaking, so to speak. Same thing with local businesses. Public transportation is an economic development driver. It drives economic activity in your community. That should be more than enough for local businesses to kick in a little bit. If you can get a local business to donate $100 to your public transportation program, great. If you can get 10 of them, that's $1,000. If you can get 100 of them, that's $10,000 just made. That's my point. You can make a decent amount of revenue through business contributions. They don't have to be large contributions on the individual business level, but they have to be, let me back that up. They don't have to be large contributions on the individual business level, but you as a champion for transit have to be engaged in that process. You have to be willing to go out and talk to people and ask for the contributions and ask them to participate. And then local bake sale type fundraising events. I use bake sale just because everybody knows what a bake sale is. It's a fundraising event, most common that we can all think of probably. Those type of fundraising events are perfectly legitimate in the transit world and in the revenue generating world. So don't be afraid to explore those types of opportunities. We have some grant recipients here in Illinois who are doing just that, and they're doing a pretty bang up job of it. You know, they might not be generating $100,000 a year in bake sale money, but they're generating enough to help them cushion the blow a little bit. Same thing on the business contribution side. We have some folks that are doing a pretty good job of engaging their local businesses, driving home the point that this is an economic activity that they want to invest in, and they're making that investment, and it's great. So the moral of that story is, you know, don't be shy. Get out there and be an advocate for your transportation program. Preach the virtues. Show everybody how important it is and how wonderful it is. And above all other things, to be perfectly honest, provide good quality service. And to me, these two are hand in hand intertwined with one another. You cannot provide a quality service if you don't have a good, solid revenue base, and you cannot get a good, solid local revenue base if you don't have good quality service. So make sure that you're meeting both of those requirements. I think it's going to take us to the end today. We didn't have any questions. Fantastic. That either means that I confused the crap out of everybody or that I answered everybody's question. Oh, we do have questions. Sorry, folks. I didn't get those notifications. I apologize. Let me just answer a couple of these questions real quick. And I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do, folks. I'm just going to go ahead and answer these individually. So I apologize for not getting to the questions. That's my fault. I apologize for not seeing these questions. I will respond to everybody individually and make sure that they all get answered. And then if I think it's something that everybody needs to hear, or that should hear, et cetera, then we'll go ahead and I'll submit these questions out to everyone after the fact. So I apologize, folks. I don't want to keep anybody any longer than we already have. As always, YouTube channel right there, feedback survey on SurveyMonkey. Please fill that out and help me out. Just for the record, I know one of the feedbacks that I get pretty consistently is copies of the forums so that we can talk about and reference the forums. I don't disagree with that feedback, and I've taken that to heart and have tried to work that in a little bit more. But if you notice we didn't go through any forums today, that's my fault. I procrastinated a little bit too long and didn't quite get as prepared as I wanted to. But I did take that to heart. I wanted to let whomever has said that multiple times, I'm on top of it, and I'm definitely going to work it in. So thank you for that. But again, I take all this feedback very seriously. Please visit the website and provide me with some input on what worked well, what didn't work well, and what you want to see work in the future. And then if you need to, you can go back and revisit this in any other PCOM informational session that we've done. And if you want to refer somebody in your office to them, you think it would be useful information for them, please do so. As always, feel free to submit a question to me via email if you have them and I didn't get a chance to answer them today. Other than that, thank you so much for your time, and we will see everybody next month. I think next month, I don't have my calendar up here. I believe next month we're right about the same time, September 18th, 19th, 20th, somewhere in that vicinity. But I'll make sure to get an email out to everybody as quickly as possible. All right. Thank you very much. Have a great day.